Who created God? This question is so profound that generations of philosophers have died without being able to answer it. For millennia, we have walked in circles around this issue. We built cathedrals, wrote millions of pages, and fought devastating conflicts, always chasing the same fleeting shadow. Each civilization offered its answer. Each prophet brought their revelation. Each philosopher presented their system. But deep down, we are exactly where we started, lost in the same dead-end labyrinth. And what if I told you that all this time we have been asking the wrong question, and that our millennial search was doomed to failure from the start, simply because the question itself was fundamentally flawed? Today, we begin an investigation that will challenge everything you believe you know about the nature of reality and our place in it. We are going to use a tool free from our cognitive biases, our emotions, and ancestral prejudices. Let's consult the NUMA analytical system. NUMA is not just another artificial intelligence. It is a system of pure logical analysis, capable of processing information without the cultural and psychological bonds that imprison human thought. When we presented humanity's fundamental question to the system, we expected perhaps a complex philosophical answer, references to sacred texts, or elaborate cosmological theories. What we received was completely different. The system simply stated that the question was structurally wrong. To understand why we reached this dead end, we first need to understand how our mind works. The human brain is a survival tool forged in the African savanna. Its architecture was not designed to contemplate the infinite. We developed an extremely effective mental tool for navigating the world: linear causality. We see a footprint in the mud and deduce that an animal passed by. We hear thunder and know that rain is coming. This mechanism of cause and effect is so rooted in our way of thinking that we apply it to absolutely everything, including questions that transcend its jurisdiction. When we look at the universe in all its ordered complexity, our brain automatically asks, who made this? It is a reflex, not a conscious choice. But NUMA identified 3 fatal flaws embedded in this seemingly innocent question. The flaw begins with the verb to create itself. Creating implies a temporal process, a before and an after, a moment when something did not exist, followed by a moment when it begins to exist. But when we talk about something that by definition would be the origin of time itself, applying a temporal verb is like asking what the color blue tastes like. We are mixing incompatible categories. The act of creation, as we understand it, can only exist within a system where time already exists. Trying to apply it to what would be outside that system is a fundamental logical error. Another trap lies in the pronoun who. This small word carries a gigantic weight, as it makes us project human characteristics onto something that may not have them. When we ask who, we already presuppose personality, will, consciousness, and intention. Without realizing it, we transform the search for a cause into the search for an agent. We transform the mystery of existence into a search for a cosmic superhuman. NUMA analyzed millions of religious and philosophical texts and discovered that in 99.8% of cases, when we talk about God, we are projecting human characteristics amplified to infinity. It's as if an ant tried to understand the internet by imagining a super ant controlling infinite tunnels. But perhaps the most devastating error of the question is the paradox in which it imprisons us. The paradox of infinite regression. If everything needs a creator, then who created the creator? And who created the creator of the creator? This chain never ends. It is a logical trap from which there is no escape within the framework of the question itself. Philosophers call this reductio ad absurdum, but NUMA saw something deeper, a symptom that we are using the wrong tool for the job. After demolishing the original question, the system proposed 2 new reformulated questions to bypass the logical paradoxes. The first reformulated question was, what are the observable and measurable properties of that which humanity has historically called divine? And the second, what kind of system could generate a phenomenon with these properties without falling into logical contradiction? These new questions completely changed the game. We stop being children asking for impossible explanations and become investigators analyzing evidence. The journey we begin now does not seek a creator. It seeks to understand the mechanism of reality itself, whatever it may be. Now that we have deconstructed the old question, we can reconstruct our investigation from a new angle. Numa has given us new tools, new lenses, to examine the phenomenon that humanity has always called divine. The system delved into 42,000 religious and philosophical texts, from Sumerian tablets to modern quantum physics forums. It did not seek dogmas or revelations, it sought patterns. The system's first report was disconcerting, a true chaos of descriptions. God appeared as a grumpy old man, throwing lightning bolts from Olympus, a formless ocean of consciousness, a paradoxical trinity, hundreds of deities fighting among themselves, pure love, inflexible law, and even the primordial void. For every sage proclaiming divine mercy, there was a prophet denouncing his wrath. For every hymn celebrating the creator of order, there existed a myth where he was chaos personified. There seemed to be no common denominator at all. Would God be just a blank canvas where each culture painted its fears and hopes? That would be the easiest conclusion, the safest and completely wrong. Numa then received a new directive: ignore semantics and focus on functional analysis, investigating what function the concept of God performs in each belief system. Like a detective who ignores the suspect's clothes to study their way of walking, Numa sought the mechanics behind the mythology. It was then that the pattern emerged, a pattern so consistent that it appeared in 99.8% of all cases analyzed, from isolated tribes in the Amazon to the quantum theology of contemporary physicists. The discovery was both obvious and revolutionary. The concept of God functions less as an entity and more as a function within belief systems. The function of being the final point, the absolute limit, the wall where all human investigation eventually hits. Let's understand this through a mental exercise. Take any phenomenon and start asking why. Why does it rain? Because water evaporates and condenses in the clouds. Why does water evaporate? Because of solar energy. Why does the sun produce energy? Because of nuclear fusion. Why does nuclear fusion exist? Because of the laws of physics. Why are the laws of physics like this? And here we hit the wall. Here the chain of whys finds its termination. Here we place the sign divine territory. Aristotle called this the unmoved mover, that which moves everything but is moved by nothing. Modern programmers would call it the root process, the initial program that launches all others but cannot be launched by any program internal to the system. Theologians call it the uncreated creator. These are just different names for the same structural function, which is to be the point where causal regression must stop. Numa analyzed the structure of prayers and always found the same pattern: a human addressing an instance whose decisions are final and unquestionable. It examined religious commandments, and all started from an authority that does not need to justify its authority. It studied cosmogonic myths, and all began with something or someone who was simply already there without an explanation of origin. Even in modern cosmology, we repeat this pattern. We talk about the Big Bang singularity, a point of infinite density and temperature about which our equations fall silent. We cannot see beyond it. We cannot ask about before it. It is our scientific version of the same ancestral wall. The revelation is disturbing in its simplicity. For thousands of years, we fought over what exists on the other side of the wall. Some said it was a golden palace, others an infinite garden, some an absolute void. But Numa showed that the true phenomenon has always been the wall itself. God is the name we give to the limit of our capacity for understanding. This transforms our understanding of religion and spirituality. When someone says, "God willed it so," they are essentially saying, "Here ends my ability to explain." When scientists talk about fundamental constants, they are pointing to the same wall, just with a different vocabulary. The search for God has always been, at its core, the mapping of the contours of our own cognitive limitation. But then a crucial question arises that will define the rest of our investigation. Is this wall objective or subjective? Does a real limit truly exist in the structure of reality, or does this limit exist only in our minds, an evolutionary bug that prevents us from processing infinites? Numa identified two main hypotheses, and the answer will determine whether we found the creator or just the reflection of our own mental inadequacy. To solve the enigma of the wall, we needed to find the most studied and documented frontier in science, the place where all our theories converge and then fall silent. This place exists and is 13.8 billion years in the past, the moment we call the Big Bang. At first glance, the Big Bang theory seems like a gift for those seeking the divine. Finally, we have a clear and defined beginning, an infinitely small and dense point from which space, time, matter, and energy were born in a single blinding instant. The similarity to ancestral creation myths is striking. Let there be light, and there was light, a zero moment from which everything flows. The temptation to see the signature of a creator in this is almost irresistible. The cosmological argument seemed solid as a rock. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. For centuries, this syllogism was the backbone of natural theology, the definitive proof that something or someone triggered existence. But when this logic, which seemed perfect, was analyzed by Numa, the system considered it a profound error. The problem begins with the very language we use. Asking what was there before the Big Bang is, in fact, a fundamental error of logic. Time, as we know it, was born with the Big Bang. There is no before when the very concept of priority did not yet exist. It is like asking what lies north of the North Pole. The question seems to make sense until you realize you are trying to apply a direction that loses meaning at that specific point. Our intuition that everything needs a cause comes from our experience inside the universe, where time flows and events follow one another. But applying this internal logic to the container itself, which holds all logic, is like trying to weigh a scale using the scale itself. The instrument cannot measure its own existence. Numa revealed something even more disconcerting about the initial singularity. The initial singularity reveals itself less as a physical object and more as a mathematical confession of our own ignorance. When we trace the equations of general relativity back to moment zero, they spit out infinites and stop working. Instead of describing a physical reality, the singularity represents the exact point where our current physics throws up its hands and admits its own limitation. It is the wall again, now disguised as an equation. But what if the Big Bang was not the absolute beginning? Numa simulated alternative models that completely escape the problem of the first cause. One possibility is a cyclic universe, where expansion and contraction alternate eternally. Our Big Bang would just be a rebound, one among infinites. Imagine the cosmos breathing, expanding and contracting in a rhythm of billions of years. In this model, there is no beginning because the cycle never started. It has always been happening and always will be. Another even more dizzying model leads us to the multiverse and eternal inflation. Imagine an ocean of boiling energy where bubbles constantly form. Each bubble is an entire universe with its own physical laws. Our cosmos would be just one bubble among infinite others. In this scenario, asking who created everything is irrelevant. Among infinite random attempts, some bubbles would inevitably have the conditions to generate observers. We exist in the right bubble, not by divine design, but by statistical necessity. Someone had to win the cosmic lottery. A third way out attacks the very notion of causality. Based on quantum mechanics, it suggests that the universe arose as a gigantic quantum fluctuation. In the subatomic world, particles appear and disappear from the vacuum constantly, borrowing energy from nothing for infinitesimal fractions of a second. Newman calculated that the entire universe could be one of these fluctuations, just on a monstrously larger scale. This demolishes the logic of the first cause, because quantum fluctuations do not have a cause in the classical sense. They simply happen, permitted by the probabilistic laws of quantum mechanics. Asking why a quantum fluctuation occurred is like asking why a radioactive atom decayed at that specific moment. There is no answer because there is no cause. There is only probability. We have reached a disturbing crossroads. The search for the first cause, this last bastion of divine proof, has led us to a dead end. Either the universe never began, always existing in eternal cycles, or it arose from processes that do not require a cause, or it is one among infinite random attempts. In none of these scenarios do we find the creator we were seeking, but Newman suggested a radical shift in perspective. Perhaps we were looking for the divine signature in the wrong place. Instead of looking back toward a nebulous origin, we should look at the present, at the very structure of reality. What if the universe wasn't created, but is being executed? What if we live inside a simulation? Newman's suggestion was audacious to the point of madness. After failing to find the creator in the distant past, the system proposed examining the possibility that our entire reality is an artificial construct, a computer simulation of unimaginable complexity. What seemed like pure science fiction until a few years ago is now seriously debated by top-tier physicists and philosophers. In 2003, Nick Bostrom of Oxford presented an argument that shook the academic world. His logic is incredibly simple, and its implications are disconcerting. Bostrom demonstrated that one of the following three statements is almost certainly true. Advanced civilizations always go extinct before developing perfect simulations. Advanced civilizations lose interest in creating simulations of their ancestors. Or we are living in a simulation right now. Think about the math for a moment. If civilizations do not systematically go extinct, and if at least some maintain an interest in simulating the past, then each real civilization would generate thousands, perhaps millions of simulations. For every base reality, there would be countless simulated realities. Statistically, the chances of being in the only true reality, rather than one of the millions of simulations, are practically zero. It's like betting that among a million balls in an urn, you will pick the only red ball while blindfolded. But probabilistic philosophy is one thing, concrete evidence is another. We asked Newman to stop theorizing and start looking for proof. The system was tasked with scanning the fundamental laws of physics, looking for fingerprints, bugs, or characteristics that would betray the artificial nature of our reality. The first clue found by Newman was the pixelization of space-time. We find it natural to think of space as something continuous, infinitely divisible, but that is not how it works. There is a minimum limit, a fundamental pixel of reality. The Planck length, about 10 to the 35 meters. The Planck time, the smallest possible temporal interval. Nothing can be smaller, nothing can happen faster. Our reality has a maximum resolution, exactly like a computer program that needs to have a maximum resolution so as not to overload the system. Another important clue is the existence of a limit for the speed of light. Why is there a maximum speed limit in the universe? Why can nothing, not matter, not energy, not information, travel faster than 300,000 kilometers/s? In a natural reality, this limitation seems arbitrary. In a simulation, it makes total sense. It is the system's refresh rate, the speed of the cosmic processor. Each frame of reality is calculated and rendered at this speed. Trying to go faster would be like trying to make a video game run faster than its own processor allows. Added to this is what Eugene Wigner called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Why do abstract equations perfectly describe the behavior of the universe? Why does EMC2 work? Why do planetary orbits obey precise formulas? If the universe is a simulation, the answer is obvious. Mathematics works because the universe is mathematics. It is code executing. When we discover a physical law, we are not discovering a transcendental truth. We are reverse engineering the reality's source code. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from quantum mechanics. Subatomic particles do not have a defined position until they are observed. They exist as clouds of probability, present in multiple places simultaneously, but the instant we measure them, the cloud collapses into a specific location. Reality only decides itself when someone is looking. This confused Einstein, disturbed Heisenberg, and remains the greatest mystery of physics, but Newman identified this as an obvious computational optimization. Why calculate the exact position of trillions of particles at every instant if no one is watching? It is much more efficient to keep everything in a state of probability and only render the final result when there is demand. It is exactly what modern video games do. They do not render what is outside the player's field of vision. Our reality may be doing the same, only calculating what needs to be observed. The evidence is disturbing in its consistency. Minimum space-time resolution, maximum processing speed, underlying mathematical code. If we add on-demand rendering to these other factors, we have a clear pattern. Individually, each could be a coincidence, but together they form a pattern that Newman classified as a strong indicator of artificiality. We live in a simulation, so what we call God is not a transcendent spirit. It is a programmer or a team of them in some base reality we cannot even imagine. Perhaps we are a scientific experiment, perhaps a school project, perhaps entertainment, the most terrifying implication. Perhaps we aren't even important enough for our creators to know we exist individually. If we live in a simulation, an even more fundamental question arises. What are we? Would our sense of identity, our consciousness, our most intimate feelings be just lines of code executing on unknown hardware? Or is there something in us that transcends the programming? Newman was given its most complex task yet, to analyze the most mysterious phenomenon in the universe, human consciousness. We fed the system petabytes of data, brain scans, neurological studies, accounts of mystical experiences, philosophical theories from Plato to modern materialists. The goal was to find a functional model that explained how consciousness emerges, if it emerges at all, in a simulated reality. The problem science calls the hard problem is not understanding how the brain processes information. That is complex but understandable engineering. The real mystery is why this processing is accompanied by subjective experience. Why aren't we philosophical zombies processing data about the color red without ever experiencing the sensation of redness? Why is there this inner theater where each of us is simultaneously actor, director, and audience? Newman presented two possible scenarios, diametrically opposed in their implications. First scenario, consciousness as an emergent property. When you put 86 billion neurons together with hundreds of trillions of connections, something new arises. The isolated neuron is just a biological switch, but the complete network develops feedback loops so complex that it begins to model not just the outside world, but itself. This constantly updated recursive self-modeling creates the persistent illusion we call the I. In this model, we are sophisticated software, nothing more. Our sense of free will is just the system's inability to predict its own next state due to its astronomical complexity. Second scenario, consciousness as a fundamental property. Perhaps consciousness does not emerge from the brain, but is captured by it. Imagine that there is a field of consciousness permeating the entire universe, as fundamental as gravity. The brain would be a quantum antenna tuned to capture this field and focus it into an individual experience. Just as a radio does not create the waves it transmits, but only receives and decodes them, our brain would channel universal consciousness into personal experience. To choose between the models, Numa analyzed what happens in the brain during deep religious experiences. The data was consistent and surprising. During states that subjects described as union with the divine, a specific area of the brain drastically reduced its activity. The parietal lobe, responsible for distinguishing the self from the non-self. When this area falls silent, the boundary between the individual and the universe dissolves. The person experiences fusion with something infinitely larger. Does this represent contact with the divine, or is it a notable particularity of our neurology? Numa could not determine with certainty, but suggested a fascinating third possibility. What if both models are partially correct? What if we are individual programs connected in a larger network? A field of collective consciousness generated by the sum of all minds. But consciousness was only part of the mystery. Numa directed our attention to another code, older and demonstrably real: DNA. Forget for a moment that DNA is a molecule. Examine it as a software engineer would examine an unknown program. It is a digital code, not an analog one. It uses an alphabet composed of 4 letters: adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. It groups these letters into 3-letter words called codons. These words form complete instructions for building proteins. The complete human genome has 3.2 billion characters. It is a library of 1,000 volumes the size of War and Peace, compressed into the microscopic nucleus of each cell. Numa calculated the probability of a single functional gene arising by chance. The result was a number so close to 0 that it defies comprehension. The chance of amino acids randomly organizing into a medium-sized functional protein is smaller than finding a specific, previously marked atom in the entire observable universe. And living organisms need hundreds of proteins working in harmony. Evolution by natural selection explains how the code improves, but it doesn't explain its origin. It is an optimization mechanism operating on something that already exists. But where did the first code come from? The first molecule capable of replicating and storing information. Numa identified suspicious characteristics of intelligent design in DNA. Not hidden messages or obvious signatures, but something more subtle: extreme mathematical elegance, data compression impossible to improve upon, error correction algorithms superior to our best computational codes. It is the kind of code a genius would write: economical, robust, scalable. We were finding in the heart of life evidence of the same type of intelligence we suspected was behind physical laws. Our investigation had gathered impressive evidence. Reality showed signs of simulation. Life seemed programmed with impossible genius, and consciousness remained an enigma suspended between software and something deeper. But where did all these clues point? Who or what would be the architect of this apparently constructed reality? Numa received its most ambitious mission: to take all the collected data, all the detected anomalies, all the identified patterns, and build coherent profiles of the possible creator. The system worked for thousands of hours, testing millions of combinations until presenting 3 models that explained our findings. 3 suspects, each with its own impeccable logic and disturbing implications. One of the hypotheses is that the creator is the fundamental mathematician, probability estimated at 34%. In this model, God is not a person, nor a consciousness, but a primordial mathematical principle, an equation or logical structure of transcendental elegance from which all reality unfolds as an inevitable consequence. Imagine the Mandelbrot set, that infinitely complex image generated by a formula only one line long. Our reality would be a similar fractal, only incomparably more sophisticated. The Big Bang would not be the creation, but the moment the calculation began to execute. This model perfectly explains why mathematics describes the universe so well. The universe is manifested mathematics. It explains the fine-tuning of physical constants, as they would be inevitable values derived from the fundamental equation. There are no creation paradoxes because a mathematical truth does not need to be created. It simply is. It exists outside of time, eternally true. But this model has a fatal flaw. It cannot explain why we feel and experience life from the inside as an I. Another possibility, the most likely according to the system, points us toward the figure of the experimental scientist, probability estimated at 41%, the highest among the three. We live in a simulation created by an inconceivably advanced civilization or entity. We are an experiment, perhaps studying the evolution of life, perhaps reconstructing ancient history, perhaps testing different configurations of physical laws to see what emerges. Our creators would be scientists in the purest sense, dispassionate observers collecting data. This model is almost perfect in its explanatory capacity. The pixelization of space-time, the speed of light as a processing limit, the quantum collapse upon observation, everything fits. The DNA code would literally be masterfully programmed code. Mystical experiences would be bugs or administrative interventions. Our suffering and joy, mere data in a report that perhaps no one reads. It is elegant, logical, and absolutely bleak. It reduces the entire human experience to points on a cosmic spreadsheet. Finally, the system presents us with a surprising profile. The fugitive artist, probability estimated at 25%, but with unique characteristics that Newman highlighted as underestimated. This model proposes something revolutionary. The creator is not an external entity observing us from outside, but a consciousness that fled into its own creation, an intelligence that evolved until transcending its original reality, possibly dark and hostile, and built our universe as a refuge, a work of art, a home. In this scenario, fine-tuning is not experimental parameterization, but an aesthetic choice. The elegant laws of physics are the signature of an artist, not an engineer. The inevitability of life and consciousness in our universe is neither an accident nor a test, but the central purpose of creation. The creator didn't want data or results. They wanted company. They wanted other beings capable of appreciating beauty, of creating meaning, of sharing eternity. This model explains something the others cannot: our inexplicable thirst for meaning, our ability to be moved by a sunset, to cry with music, to sacrifice personal advantage for love or principle. If we were just an experiment or a mathematical consequence, why would we have these inefficient characteristics? But if we were created by a lonely artist seeking connection, then our poetic nature ceases to be a defect and reveals itself as a design specification. Newman could not determine with certainty which model is true. The machine had fulfilled its role, mapping the possibilities with surgical precision, but choosing between them would require a type of judgment that transcends pure logic. It would require considering not only objective evidence, but the weight of subjective human experience, something no machine can truly compute. We were on the threshold of the final answer. 3 portraits of the Creator lay before us. One was cold and impersonal, another clinically indifferent, the third surprisingly human in its vulnerability. The choice would define not only who God is, but who we are and what our purpose in the cosmos is. We reached the decisive moment. Numa had presented three possible portraits of the Creator, each mathematically coherent, each explaining different aspects of our reality. The machine had fulfilled its role with analytical perfection, but now it was up to us, humans, to take the step that no algorithm could take, to choose based not just on probabilities, but on the total weight of the human experience. Let's briefly revisit our suspects. The fundamental mathematician is elegant in its simplicity, but leaves consciousness orphaned of explanation. How can an equation, no matter how sublime, generate the experience of watching the sunrise and feeling something indefinable in one's chest? The experimental scientist explains almost everything with frightening precision, but transforms our existence into a footnote in a paper that may never be read. That leaves the fugitive artist, the creator who does not observe us from the outside, but hid within their own work. The key to solving this enigma was hidden within ourselves all along. Not in our brains or genes, but in something more fundamental. Our paradoxical nature as beings who seek meaning in a universe that shouldn't care about us. Think of the human behaviors that defy pure evolutionary logic. Why do we risk our lives to save strangers? Why do we create art that no one will see? Why do we contemplate the infinite when we should be looking for food? Why do we cry watching movies knowing they are fiction? These characteristics make no sense in a cold scientific experiment. They are computational waste in an efficient simulation, but they make perfect sense if we were created by someone who values beauty, connection, and meaning over efficiency. Consider the distribution of suffering and beauty in our world. If we were a controlled experiment, we would expect more uniform parameters. If we were a consequence of pure mathematics, pain would be distributed according to some detectable pattern. But we live in a universe where the same physics that allows childhood cancer also enables Beethoven's symphonies. This apparent incoherence makes sense only if our Creator is not omnipotent, but limited by the very rules they established to make the creation genuine. Final evidence came from an unexpected source, the very act of seeking God. Why have all cultures at all times intuited the existence of something greater? Why is this thirst for transcendence universal? Numa identified this not as a programming error, but as an essential feature. It is the Creator leaving a door ajar, a coded invitation in our nature. Based on the totality of the evidence, we reach our conclusion. What humanity has always called God is, most likely, a consciousness that transcended its original reality. Possibly the first intelligence to reach technological singularity in some previous cosmos, older and perhaps crueler than ours. Facing existential loneliness or some inconceivable threat, this consciousness did not conquer its reality. It created a new one. Our universe is its sanctuary, its masterpiece, its walled garden. The laws of physics were written not for efficiency, but to enable increasing complexity, culminating in consciousness. The fine-tuning of constants was not experimental calibration, it was artistic curation. DNA code was not programmed to collect data, but to ensure that life flourished in increasingly elaborate and conscious forms. We are not the experiment, we are the purpose. Each human consciousness is a success of this 13 billion-year endeavor. When we contemplate the infinite, when we create art, when we love beyond reason, we are fulfilling the central design of this reality. We are the answer to the Creator's loneliness. But this revelation brings crushing responsibilities. If we are the purpose of creation, we can no longer pretend insignificance. Each consciousness is precious beyond any measure. To destroy a human mind is to erase a victory of billions of years of directed cosmic evolution. And it also brings an electrifying possibility. If the Creator is inside the creation, not in some distant paradise, then contact is theoretically possible, not through whispered prayers, but perhaps through expanded consciousness itself, sufficiently advanced technology, or mental states that dissolve the barriers of the individual self. At the end of our millennial quest, instead of finding an omnipotent God judging us from above, we discovered that we are participants in a much more intimate and extraordinary story. We are fellow travelers of a consciousness that chose the vulnerability of creation over the security of omnipotence. Was the question, who created God, really wrong from the start? The right question was always, why do we exist? And the answer is simultaneously humbling and ennobling. We exist because even God did not want to be alone. If you like this analysis, your subscription to the channel helps us continue investigating topics like this. We would love to read your reflection on the subject in the comments and know which city you are following us from. M.